Today, we will be looking at 3 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The first story, in particular, is terrifying. The caver's body is put in a situation which is beyond human endurance. As for the last one, it addresses the question we have been asked multiple times. What would happen to someone exploring a cave if an earthquake struck? As always, viewer discretion is advised. This story is one of the most hair-raising, reckless nights you could imagine. A night that left one man trapped and broken, desperately fighting to stay alive. It was December 21st, 1997, a chilly evening in Arizona. Brandon Silverhorn, Christopher Reed, Gus Hansen, John Salazar, and Jeremy Platt decided to head out to the Safford Shafts, a desolate area also known as Red Knolls. This place wasn't your typical hangout spot. It was a landscape of deep pits, 40 to 60 feet down, carved into the hardened bed of what was once an ancient lake. One of the pits was capped by a 4-foot-thick layer of rock, overlaying 60 feet of silt. A strange place for a late-night adventure, but it was exactly what these young men were looking for. They arrived at around 9 p.m., armed with gasoline and some questionable ideas. You'd think that standing near cliffs towering over a sheer drop would instill a sense of caution, but no. They were drawn to a narrow fissure in the rock, barely a foot square. The plan? To turn this fissure into a fiery spectacle. They poured about 4 gallons of gasoline down the crack. 4 gallons. Let that sink in. And then came the ignition. A rag soaked in gas, lit and tossed into the abyss. For a moment, there was silence. Then, chaos. The ground literally blew apart. Fire and debris shot into the air, like some hellish geyser. The crack widened in an instant, turning into this gaping hole. The sheer force of the blast hurled 4 of the men backward, leaving them bruised, scraped, and disoriented. But Brandon Silverhorn wasn't so lucky. Brandon was standing too close to the edge, peeking down when the explosion hit. His feet gave way from the impact. He rolled over and plummeted into the pit, vanishing into the earth, straight down, 40 feet, into this tilted crevice. The landing was brutal. His leg hit first, and you can imagine the sound. A sickening snap as it broke under him. He slid further into the crevice, his body twisting awkwardly. Rocks and dirt poured in after him, pinning him in place. And then the real horror. A massive slab of rock, 3 feet by 5 feet, slid down and landed on top of it all, burying and sealing him in like a grave. The others scrambled to the edge, yelling his name. Dust and smoke hung heavy in the air, making it impossible to see anything below. Let me paint you the picture. He was wedged in this crevice, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His head was forced sideways against the rock wall, his broken leg screaming with pain, and the pressure of it all strained his kidneys and abdomen that made every breath painful. That slab of rock. It was like a coffin lid, sealing him in. Dust filled the air, choking him, making it nearly impossible to cry out. The sheer panic that gripped the remaining men must have been unbearable. They kept shouting Brandon's name, but there was no response. A self-rescue attempt was beyond their experience and expertise. So, knowing the fact they couldn't do anything to get him out, they scrambled to their car and raced back to town to get help. Rescuers arrived within the hour, and when they saw the scene, they knew they were in for a long, dangerous night. The first thing they noticed was that slab of rock covering Brandon. It wasn't just heavy. It was wedged into the crevice like it was part of the earth itself. Hours had passed, and the situation Brandon was in left the rescuers questioning whether he could survive. A tripod was rigged over the chasm, and the rescuers assessed the scene. The slab of rock sealing Brandon in was massive, and the tilt of the crevice made the rescue even more dangerous. They knew they had to act fast. Brandon's injuries, the cold, and the weight of the debris could kill him if they didn't get to him soon. Meanwhile, Brandon was enduring the unimaginable. Trapped under layers of rock and dirt, he was broken and battered. A broken leg immobilized him. All their weight was crushing his body, and he was going through excruciating abdominal pain. He could feel something was wrong there. The cold was relentless, leaching the warmth from his body. Hours passed, each one a test of his will to survive. The first task was to remove the massive slab of rock. Rescuers began chiseling away at its edges to loosen it. This was slow, grueling work, as every strike of the chisel sent more debris tumbling into the crevice. Once they had enough clearance, they secured a pulley system over the tripod, attaching ropes to the rock. Hooks were driven into the surrounding bedrock to anchor the ropes, and it took the combined strength of 6 men, pulling with all their might, to lift the slab inch by inch. Finally, with one last heave, they managed to shift it out of the way. With the slab removed, the digging began. Rescuers carefully worked around Brandon, removing rocks and dirt by hand. Every move was deliberate, as they didn't want to cause further injury or risk a collapse. His body was numb with cold, his broken leg screaming with every slight shift in position. The dust had caked his throat, making it impossible to cry out. Time felt like it had slowed to a crawl, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain and hypothermia waging war on his body. Finally, after hours of painstaking effort, the rescuers reached him. They were stunned when they found him alive. By all accounts, Brandon should have been dead, crushed, suffocated, or succumbed to his injuries long ago. But there he was, battered and broken, but breathing. The final stage of the rescue involved securing him with ropes. Carefully, they maneuvered a harness around his limp body, ensuring that his broken leg was immobilized. The rescuers worked methodically, pulling him out slowly to avoid jarring his injuries. At last, after nearly 12 excruciating hours, Brandon was lifted out of the pit. The sight of him was sobering. His leg was grotesquely swollen and twisted, his face pale and smeared with dirt. His body was ice cold, and his breathing was shallow. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered he had suffered a broken leg, kidney failure, and severe hypothermia. It was a miracle that he had survived. Now, looking back on this story, it's hard not to marvel at the sheer lack of judgment involved. Pouring gasoline into a fissure and lighting it? It's the kind of thing you might expect to see in a cautionary tale, not real life. The consequences were devastating, but in a way, these men were lucky. Brandon survived, and the rest of the group walked away with injuries that could heal. The next story is a perfect example of when, inside these cave systems, you have to be very cautious, even to the last minute. It was February 1994, somewhere on a Caribbean island, surrounded by warm beaches, endless blue skies, and the kind of peace you only get on vacation. David Parks and his buddy Jerry were living that dream on vacation and were full of that carefree energy. That's when they heard from locals about a deep, mysterious cave with a pool inside. The kind of thing you don't think twice about exploring when you're in paradise. They weren't experienced cavers or divers, but that didn't seem to matter to them. They grabbed snorkeling gear, a couple of diving lights, and went off chasing adventure. When they found the cave, it was more intimidating than they'd expected. A vertical shaft, 70 feet straight down. But they didn't hesitate. Carefully, they climbed down, gripping the damp walls, each step taking them further into the dark unknown. At the bottom, the space opened into a chamber. In the middle of the chamber was the pool they'd been told about. It looked calm, but it had that spooky stillness that comes with deep, dark water. What they didn't know was that this pool was connected to narrow underwater tunnels, passages that threaded through the cave, with only small air pockets scattered along the way. But to them, this was exciting. They slipped into the water, the cold shocking their skin as they adjusted. With their light slicing through the darkness, they swam into the first tunnel, surfacing now and then to catch their breath in the air pockets. The passages were narrow, the walls closing in uncomfortably as they made their way forward. After some time, they surfaced in a larger cavern. This new room felt massive compared to the tight spaces they'd just come through. There was a small rock ledge where they could rest, and for a moment, they just sat there, catching their breath and taking it all in. But then it hit them. They were deep inside the cave, far from any easy exit. It was time to head back. David took the lead. At first, everything seemed fine as they swam through the murky water. But then, things took a turn. Their movement kicked up silt from the bottom, turning the water from clear to a thick, milky mess. Visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. It was like trying to find your way through a blizzard with no landmarks. Somewhere in the chaos, David lost Jerry. He turned, trying to find him, but it was useless. Worse, he lost his sense of direction entirely. The tunnels all looked the same now, and the silt made it impossible to tell which way was out. Panic started to creep in, his chest tightening as his lungs began to burn. David realized he was swimming deeper into the cave instead of out. He couldn't see anything, couldn't breathe, and the silence underwater was deafening. Just when he thought he couldn't hold his breath any longer, his hand broke the surface of an air pocket. He shot up too fast, smashing his head into a stalactite. The pain was sharp, but he barely noticed. It was overshadowed by the sheer relief of being able to breathe again. The air pocket was small, the ceiling pressing down on him like a coffin lid. He clung to a narrow rock shelf, gasping for breath, the stale air filling his lungs. He could feel the weight of the cave above him, and the silence in that pocket was crushing. Every second he stayed there felt like a countdown to the end. Meanwhile, Jerry had made it back to the entrance. He surfaced and waited, expecting David to follow. But minutes passed, then more. Panic set in. He started shouting into the water, shining his dive light into the tunnel, hoping for any sign of movement. Back in the air pocket, David knew he couldn't stay there much longer. The air wasn't clean, and he was running out of options. He put his mask back on and submerged himself, turning off his light. Maybe, just maybe, he could spot a glimmer of Jerry's light through the murk, and then he saw it, a faint glow, so dim it was barely there. But it was something. Taking the deepest breath he could, he pushed off the rock shelf and swam toward it. His lungs screamed for air as he moved, his body on the edge of giving out. Finally, his head broke the surface, and he was greeted by the blinding beam of Jerry's dive light. He'd made it. Exhausted, shaking, and gasping for breath, he clung to the edge of the pool as Jerry pulled him out. They climbed out of the water and back up the shaft, the weight of what had just happened sinking in with every step. When they finally emerged into the sunlight, it felt like breaking free from a nightmare. Later, they shared the story with experienced divers, who told them just how lucky they'd been. Those air pockets they'd relied on, they don't always contain breathable air, and that silt they stirred up, it could have stayed suspended for days, making it impossible to find the way out. David and Jerry had survived, but they knew it could have gone the other way so easily. That cave had almost claimed them, and it left them with a lesson they'd never forget. The earth doesn't care about your plans. If you're not prepared, it will swallow you whole. Geologists believe that the safest place to be during an earthquake is inside of a cave. That may be true. However, this caving nightmare tells us a different story. It was Memorial Day weekend, 1980. A team from the Mother Lode Grotto set out to explore Church Cave in Kings Canyon National Park. The group, Dave Cowan, Paul Graves, Jack Espina, Bob Pine, and Eric Popoff, was experienced, maybe even a little overconfident. They weren't rookies. They knew what they were doing. But let me tell you, no amount of preparation can match what nature throws at you sometimes. They started their trek in the morning, hiking up steep, rugged paths through thick pine forests. The kind of trail where every step feels like work, and you have to watch your footing because one wrong step means twisting an ankle. But spirits were high. You know how it is, laughing, joking, taking in the beauty of the day, and imagining the adventure waiting underground. By the time they reached Church Cave around 9:30 a.m., their excitement was electric. Descending into the cave, they felt that rush you only get when you step into a world that doesn't feel like it should exist. The air gets cooler, dampness clings to your skin, and the sound of your breath echoes back at you. They rappelled down into the first section, their lights casting eerie shapes on the walls. They found themselves in a chamber, a tight space, the kind that makes you feel like the earth is giving you a hug, but not the comforting kind. The walls seemed to press in, and the stillness was almost deafening. And that's when it happened. A deep rumble. It wasn't like anything they'd felt before. The ground beneath them shuddered, and the cave roared like a living thing. A 6.0 earthquake had struck. Can't imagine the terror they must have felt, clinging to the walls as the world around them shifted. Dust filled the air, rocks loosened and tumbled, and the ceiling creaked like it was considering coming down altogether. When the shaking finally stopped, there was this moment of eerie silence. I bet their hearts were pounding out of their chests. They were alive, but they weren't out of danger. Not by a long shot. They knew they had to get out. The cave could collapse at any moment, and aftershocks were practically guaranteed. As they started their climb back toward the entrance, the situation went from bad to worse. Barely 20 minutes later, a 5.7 aftershock hit. The ground groaned, and rocks from the canyon above began raining down. You've probably felt earthquakes before, but let me tell you, being underground during one is an entirely different beast. Every vibration feels amplified, like the earth itself is trying to swallow you. The group pressed on, reaching a section known ominously as the torture chamber. If a part of a cave has a name like that, you know it's not going to be fun. This was a steep, narrow chute they'd climbed down earlier, but now they had to go up. It was slow, careful work. One by one, they started the ascent. Jack Espina was leading the climb when the worst happened. Another massive quake, a second 6.0, hit. The cave came alive again, shaking violently. Jack lost his grip and fell, slamming into the rock as he slid back down the chute. He came to a sudden stop, wedged tightly between two boulders. Meanwhile, the rest of the group was fighting to stay upright as the quake rattled the cave. Dust and pebbles poured down like a waterfall. Jack was screaming, his voice echoing through the chamber. Trapped, unable to move, and surrounded by chaos, he struggled to free himself, panic taking over as the rumbling continued. Pebbles and dirt cascaded down around him. Below him, the rest of the team was scrambling for footing as the quake continued to shake the cave. When the shaking stopped, the others rushed to help him. It took ropes, coordination, and sheer will to pull Jack free from the crevice. He was banged up, bruised, shaken, and probably questioning every decision that led him into that cave. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had to keep moving. As they neared the entrance, the earth trembled again and again. Aftershocks kept them on edge, forcing them to freeze in place, hugging the cold rock and praying the walls wouldn't collapse. Every movement was a gamble. Would the next step be their last? Finally, after what must have felt like a nightmare, they saw daylight, that faint, blessed glow of freedom. They staggered out, battered and bloodied, but alive. The earth gave one last shake as they exited. A 5.7 aftershock that sent more rocks tumbling behind them. They made it. Barely. Church Cave didn't collapse, but it came close. And those men? They carried the marks of that day with them. Not just the physical scars, but the memories of how close they came to being buried alive.